The next term is neoliberalism, neoliberalization, and our next speaker is Dasha Kuletskaya. She's born in Minsk, Belarus, she's an architect and research associate at the Faculty of Architecture at RWTH Aachen. In 2021, she received the IDEA-League research grant to conduct research with the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture, GTR, at ETH Zürich. Her research focuses on questions of land, finance, real estate, architecture, and the production of housing in the context of global capitalism. In her doctoral dissertation, Dasha Kuletskaya, she focuses on post-Soviet transition in the housing market in Minsk. Great that you're here, and I think we are all excited to learn more about your term. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for the... Thank you, Stefan, for the invitation and the introduction. It's great to be here. And for my presentation today, I was asked to talk about neoliberalism in 10 minutes. A daunting task indeed, especially since the majority of academic publications on the topic, including the recent 600-page Routledge Handbook on Neoliberalism, open with a somewhat cliché sentence that neoliberalism, and I quote, is a slippery concept meaning different things to different people. Therefore, I would like to limit my today's presentation to just 3 things. First, I will outline briefly the genealogy of neoliberalism as a concept and highlight the controversies surrounding it. Second, I will talk about the application of neoliberalism in architectural research. And finally, I will talk briefly how I apply this concept in my own research. The concept of neoliberalism is a perfect example of how an originally neutral academic concept captured public imagination and became the victim of its own success. Today, neoliberalism is being often criticized for being used to describe pejoratively anything that left academic, political, and activist circles don't like about contemporary economic systems, be it free markets, privatization, or rising inequality. At the same time, many critics of the concept also note that neoliberalism is not being used in contemporary economic debates. How come? Let me now trace briefly the history of the term. Until the 1970s, neoliberalism was used mostly as a neutral category to describe economic ideas from the 1930s and 60s, loosely associated with the German economic miracle, Mont Pelerin Society, work of Friedrich Hayek, and the Chicago School. By the early 80s, neoliberalism acquired its negative connotation and came to describe the wave of market deregulation, privatization, and welfare state withdrawal. Later, the concept expanded beyond the policy model and began to signify a broader political, ideological, cultural, and spatial phenomena. By the 1990s, neoliberalism had become viewed as an epochal phenomena, what Rajesh Venugopal called a dystopian zeitgeist. If before 1980s, neoliberalism was mainly a technical term used scarcely and only by economists, after 1980s, it became loaded with various, mostly negative meanings and used excessively in social sciences except economics, where it has largely disappeared. This disparity between economics and other social sciences and their attitude towards neoliberalism is indicative of a deep divide between these fields, with critics of neoliberalism being routinely accused of economic illiteracy. So, how could one define this slippery concept? In academic literature, one can identify 2 standard approaches to neoliberalism. As Simon Springer called them, neoliberalism as a noun and neoliberalism as a verb. The first approach discusses neoliberalism as an ideology or doctrine. This approach is mainly concerned with analysis of canonical texts by Friedrich Hayek and others and their interpretation. The second approach regards neoliberalism not as a condition, but as an embedded and variegated process, and names it, according to its dynamic nature, neoliberalization. This trend of research originated in the field of human geography and looks into so-called actual existing neoliberalisms, in plural, unique but united by the same logic at work. Bob Chessup defines neoliberalization as a distinctive economic, political, and social project that tends to judge all economic activities in terms of profitability and all social activities in terms of their contribution to differential capital accumulation. Many scholars have argued that the dynamic concept of neoliberalization is a more productive analytical tool than a static concept of neoliberalism. Now, let me turn to the concept of neoliberalism in architectural research. With an indicative far-afield delay, the concept of neoliberalism entered architectural debate rather late, about 5 years after the global financial crisis. You can see here on a slide some of the groundbreaking studies in the field. Among these publications, one can identify 4 distinct approaches to theorize the relationship between architecture and neoliberalism. First, the theoretical discussion that attempts to link architectural discourse with a neoliberal ideology. Second, the attempt to link aesthetic characteristic of architectural objects with a neoliberal ideology. These 2 approaches are in line with the neoliberalism as a noun strand of research. Third is the attempt to connect singular architectural projects with urban policies associated with neoliberalism. And the fourth approach is represented by studies that try to examine the role architecture plays in processes of neoliberal restructuring. Here, the role of architecture as profession comes into foreground. These last 2 approaches have a more dynamic nature and mostly belong to the neoliberalism as a verb strand of research. These 4 approaches vary in terms of objects of their studies: architectural texts, iconic buildings, everyday built environments, housing, and architecture as profession. In terms of geography, these studies are mainly concentrated in the first world, although this in no way reflects the geography of neoliberalization. The recent edited volume, Neoliberalism on the Ground, is a notable exception from this rule. Well, now I'd like to turn very briefly to my own research, which is mainly focused on neoliberalization or neoliberal shift in former socialist countries, with one of the main case studies being recent housing developments in Minsk, Belarus. Many scholars and journalists, especially from outside of Belarus, like to repeat the somewhat cliché opinion that Minsk has remained a museum of socialism where the populist government headed by Alexander Lukashenko refuses to back neoliberal reforms and protects the interest of the broader population against the speculative desires of the elites. However, this perception no longer holds when one considers the recent shift in housing policies in Minsk. I argue that the authoritarian government in contemporary Belarus has the capacity to implement neoliberal policies even more efficiently than democratic states. This efficiency is achieved through the total control over the legal system and the capacity to suppress any forms of popular resistance. On urban scale, this development can be best illustrated taking operations of Dana Holdings, a private real estate company owned by Serbian oligarch family Karic, as an example. Between 2009 and 2021, Dana Holdings was granted for free over 14 square kilometers of land in prime locations of Minsk. You can see these plots marked yellow here in a figure plan of Minsk on a slide. These developments are regulated by special presidential decrees, which rank second high after the constitution and Belarusian legal system, and have the power to overrule all other legislative documents, including zoning laws and building regulations. In case of developments by Dana Holdings, these decrees allow for highly speculative housing developments with rates of return on investment over 60%. In 2020, Dana Holdings accounted for the construction of 44.4% of residential space in Minsk. You can see some of the projects here on slides. In my research, I try to trace how speculative mechanisms defined in presidential decrees affect these projects on all scales, from urban layout to the layout of individual flats. But unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about this in detail. To conclude, as I showed in the beginning of my presentation, neoliberalism is indeed a slippery concept. Nevertheless, I argue that in its dynamic form, it is also an extremely powerful concept that allows to analyze seemingly unconnected developments in various parts of the world and to identify similar logic behind them. However, in order to be applied in such a manner, neoliberalism should be used as an analytical tool and not as a rhetorical device for moral condemnation. As Rajesh Venugopal argued, and I quote, "There is something very inadequate about the way that mainstream economics is understood, theorized, critiqued, and represented outside that realm. Neoliberalism is not the entirety of the problem, but it remains emblematic of many liberties that are taken with this discipline. Acknowledging this inadequacy is not tantamount to a defense of economics and its many failings, or even to suggest that any critique of it requires one to be intellectually invested in the canon. It does, however, require a greater degree of immersion in the material to make this critique relevant. The task of understanding and explaining contemporary economic thought and its consequences is crucial and requires a far greater depth and sophistication of intellectual engagement with the subject matter at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dasha Kuletskaya.